Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's daily recap. It is Friday, May 1st. Hope everybody had a nice week. It was a pretty action-packed week. Uh, from my vantage point, I saw a lot of stocks, on the heels of earnings this week, breaking down, big sell-off in biotech. For the better part of the week, we saw a little bit of a bounce today. Here's the IBB, and I shouldn't really be much of a surprise in that, I think I talked about it in yesterday's recap, into support where, it's typical to see bounces occur, and that bounce occurring mostly on a gap up this morning, and then, trading higher throughout the course of the remainder of the day on, undercutting the volume here on the bounce. You can see definitely lighter volume in today's bounce. And it wouldn't surprise me if we saw this continue, slightly higher over the next, through the weekend, maybe into Monday, Tuesday, before potentially, there may be a turning point. And that could certainly last longer. We may build a longer-term base here before ultimately determining what the next leg of this trade is. After making a low and then, holding that low, making a lower high, I anticipate that this should set up and then, potentially give us another trade down. If we zoom out and we look at a weekly chart just to get a sense of, larger support, resistance, areas of significance, the next area in terms of support of substance, I think substantial support would be somewhere probably in this, general area. You can see this is really the area where the last major breakout occurred. And I suspect if we do start to trade lower and we do take out these lows here, then we may see a trade back down into that, that level in the weeks to come. So we'll keep an eye on how that sets up here in biotech. But you can see the massive volume this week on the selling off of these, off the top end of this range. So biotech still very much in play and taking, like I said, a little bit of a bounce today, and that looks like basically what the market did. Now we look at the spiders, doesn't quite look as the same. We have our top, or our resistance, I should say, in place. I don't want to call something a top until it, potentially really does turn. We saw some pretty significant selling for the better part of the week, and then today, if we look at the daily chart just to kind of get a sense of what happened, we gapped up today, and in a matter of one day, probably took back about 50% of this week's sell-off in basically one session, but again, on lighter volume. I respect price more so than anything else, so I respect the fact that we did, snap back pretty substantially. Is this just a short-term bounce for, some follow-through next week? I guess is to be determined. We know definitively that there is massive resistance up here, and it has been tested, several times at this point. So before we go and start, buying this bottom, I think you really got to watch how price acts early next week. I think Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday could be very telling as to a higher or lower here in the days and weeks to come. So very interesting week, and just on this point, and I mentioned this yesterday, a break of this little, channel over the last couple of weeks yesterday. Is this just a snapback here into that, that then gets sold off again? So a lot of possibilities and scenarios going into next week, but I think the takeaway here is to really know that the market is, I think, at a pretty interesting inflection point, and we do have our very strong levels that you have to pay attention to in terms of both support and resistance. Definitely a challenging trade. We continue to, jump around. Up, down, down, back to up. Just a lot of bouncing back and forth in the S&P index. If we look at the Qs, a little bit different looking. I think the selling was a little more. Where are my Qs? There we are. Selling was a little bit more pronounced this week. We still got that gap up and that trade higher today on lighter volume, but definitely I think a little bit more of a pronounced week of selling in the Qs, and I think mostly led by some of the big NASDAQ stocks Amazon, had a pretty, aggressive move down since earnings, basically undercutting the earnings low right here and trading lower, and a little bit of a bounce today from that four. I think it bottomed around 416. So we'll see. We'll see how this sets up over the next couple of days. I suspect you might see a couple of days of some sideways price action here, and then you might get another trade down to fill this gap in the upper 390s, low 400s. So I'd keep an eye on that trade going into next week or possibly the week after. But it's been a pretty rough trading from earnings season. Apple selling off pretty aggressively, bouncing back today. Are these bounces again short-lived and just dead cat bounces for further selling to come? Facebook, Twitter, all been hit pretty hard, and these have been sort of tech darlings, if you would, over the last couple of months or over the last year or so plus. So like I said, an interesting week. Earnings is always an opportunistic time for those that are flexible. I know Scott talked about it in his morning note. And Jeff Cooper in the Cooper Reports had a bunch of trades in both biotech and some of the earnings plays that have been pretty good. And lots of content being disseminated throughout the T3 Live world for both trade ideas and risk management. So make sure you're kind of soaking it all in and getting the most out of it and using it to your advantage. As always, have a great weekend, and we'll talk to you next week.